Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Bibliotherapy Live, which is all about snails in literature, which many people have commented is quite a niche subject. I agree, that is a niche subject, but I was inspired by Captain Corelli's Mandolin, in which there is a really wonderful snail scene. And I'm sure that anyone that's read Captain Corelli will remember that amazing molluscan scene, which is actually the beginning of the love affair between Captain Antonio Corelli and Pelagia. And I'm going to be talking more about that soon. But while people are joining this evening's session, I'm going to give you a few snail facts. And I'm just going to tell you first about my beginning of my obsession with snails, which began when we lived in Trinidad when I was in my late teens. And there I encountered some of the biggest snails in the world, which are the giant African snails. I don't know if you can see that well, but look at that snail, which is the size of somebody's hand. And in Trinidad, there were many of those giant snails. Hi, Colleen, great to see you this evening. Thanks for joining me. And hi, Woolstonbury Co, great to see you here. And Nora. I'm sorry, I've been away for a few weeks with the summer holidays, with going camping in Cornwall and the Lake District. So I've missed a few sessions, and it's really lovely to be back with live bibliotherapy once again. So tonight's theme is snails in literature, and I was just saying that I'm going to start with some snail facts and just reverting to my early obsession with snails. It all began when we lived in Trinidad and we used to drive up our drive and we would see these giant snails on the drive, which were literally the size of your hand with height and length. Some of them were probably about 12 inches long. And sometimes accidentally, as we drove up the drive, one would go under our wheels. We did try and avoid them. And you would hear a horrifying crunch of the snail shell cracking, which was actually very traumatizing considering how big those snails are. Anyway, snails are gastropod mollusks. They are members of the phylum Mollusca. When they feel threatened, they retreat into their shell. The largest snail is the giant African snail, which can be found in many parts of the Caribbean, as well as some parts of Africa and South America. Most snails live between 2 and 5 years, which I didn't realise. I always thought they might have a much shorter lifespan. In France, they are edible and called escargot, and in fact they are eaten in many parts of the world. And in the famous Captain Corelli scene, that's all about finding snails to eat. I'm sure that many of you here this evening have eaten snails. Let me know if you have. They are mostly hermaphrodites. They have both male and female reproductive organs. The speed of a snail is between 0.5 and 0.8 inches per second. If they moved without stopping, it would take them more than a week to move 1 kilometre. Colleen, I think definitely some snails are poisonous, and it's definitely not recommended that you eat African snails, which are these massive ones that we used to see in Trinidad. But I'd love to know about people's experiences with snails, whether they've eaten them happily or unhappily. Land snails cover the entrance of their shell with a dry mucus secretion called epiphragm, but few of them do it with a structure. With many of them, it's just a kind of strange membrane. They don't change their shells when they grow up. Instead, the shell grows along with them. One really interesting fact that I didn't know until today is that snails actually breathe with a lung. For some reason, it didn't occur to me that snails would have a lung, but apparently they have a very primitive kind of lung. And another fascinating and slightly horrifying fact about snails is that a single garden snail can have up to 430 hatchlings after 1 year. That's just one single snail. And lots of these stories that I'm going to be talking about this evening in literature are very much about the fecundity of snails, because they do breed at a rather terrifying and horrifying rate. Many snails, unfortunately, are in danger of extinction, so all the more reason that we should be celebrating the snail and making the most of their strange slitheriness and praising them and lauding them to the skies, because they do a lot of wonderful things. They symbolize many different things too, and we're going to be touching on what they symbolize this evening as we go along. But you will all no doubt be aware of Matisse and his fantastic snail that he created that was huge, made of paper. Dali was very keen on painting snails as a symbol of lack of sexuality. And snails have also represented resurrection, purity, and our own mortality, because snails were very frequently painted by the Dutch masters, slithering over fruit and vegetables to symbolize the eventual death of all matter. Tracy, thanks for joining this evening. Lovely to see you. You've just been commenting on my running over a snail story, saying that you once run over a turtle. That must have been a terrible moment. Yes, it was really traumatizing running over the snail, because it was such a big creature, really, really large, and one did feel that it had understanding and knowledge, but who knows? That's not something that we'll be touching on tonight, because I don't know a lot about the understanding of snails. So land snails have featured in the human culture from ancient times, but it's also worth mentioning that sea snails are also very common, and all the shells that you see on a beach are originally, or pretty much all of them, obviously not all of them, but many, many of the shells that you see on a beach are originally made from sea snails. That's another fact that I was unaware of. But obviously when you look at shells closely, you normally see that they are snail-shaped. From earliest times, snails have been part of myths and legends, some even depicting the creation of the world. And as a start to this rather fun and interesting evening, I'm going to tell you about some of the snail myths from around the world. You can see that I have a snail on my eyebrow, and it's been slithering across my face, leaving a bit of a trail of snail slime. Quite a lot of artists are obsessed with snails, I'd just like to point out, and I once saw a rather amazing female artist nude, covered in snails, as part of an installation that she was doing. And I'm going to remind myself who she was and post it later on so that you can look her up. But it's quite a disturbing and brilliant image, seeing her lying down covered in snails and the snails slowly moving over her body. There's definitely something perhaps erotic about snails. That's something interesting to explore, and which we will be touching on through some of the stories that we talk about tonight too. So creation myths with snails. From Nauru, which is a place 3,500 kilometres from eastern Australia, an island, comes the creation myth that at the beginning, the only things in existence were Erop Enap, a spider, and the sea. Erop Enap searched for food in the darkness and found an enormous clam, which swallowed him. He used 2 snails and a worm to find a way to open the clam. Erop Enap made the lower clamshell into earth and the upper shell into the sky, and sent the smallest snail west of the sky shell, where it became the moon. The second snail was sent to the east and became the sun. So that's a pretty epic creation myth in which snails are absolutely key and become the actual moon and the sun, which makes a kind of sense with their round shells, which are full of creation and also protect the snail and protect humanity. Another creation myth which is from the Yoruba people of Nigeria, tells that in the beginning, the universe consisted only of the sky, the water, and the wild marshlands. The god Obatala believed that the world needed more, so he went to Oloran, ruler of the sky and creator of the sun, asking for permission to create mountains, valleys, forests, and fields. Obatala descends into Earth to a place called If, carrying a snail shell filled with sand, a white hen, a black cat, and a palm nut. When he reached the Earth, Obatala spread the sand and planted the nut. After a while, he decided to fashion human beings to keep him company because his task was quite lonely. Fair enough, I say. Humans created by Obatala come together to form the first Yoruba village in If. Colleen has just mentioned that she used to step on snails with bare feet in the garden by accident. I'm glad that you mentioned it was by accident, because for a minute it looked as if you might have been enjoying stepping on them in bare feet. I have quite frequently trodden on snails too, and it's really unpleasant. But I do admire the little creatures, and I saw one the other day that was on the top of our car, and it managed to go all the way from our home near Brighton to the Lake District, a 6-hour journey. It had been sitting on the roof, just under the roof rack, and it managed to cling on all that way, and I liberated it into a lovely garden in the lakes, and I hope that it now has a few more years of happiness in a different county. Another creation myth involving snails comes from a Navajo Indian source from Northern America, which tells that long ago there was a mighty flood, and the people left their world, the fourth world, the underworld, and came up into the fifth world, the world lived in today. They found themselves on the shore of a great ocean. The people broke into groups by clan and went out to find new homes. But at the end of 4 days, they came back to the place by the ocean, as there was no fresh water to drink. First woman stood in front of the people and said that someone would have to go back down to the old world to find fresh water. She sent several strong animals to find it, but none of them succeeded. A thin little girl called Snail Girl offered to search, though most thought she surely would fail, being so thin and feeble-seeming. First woman tied a bottle to the girl's back, and she set off slowly. After a long time, she found her way to the underworld, and there she found some pure water. She filled the bottle and carried it back, but it opened and spilled, leaving a silvery trail. This created a large river. Snail Girl was thanked and honoured by the people. First woman declared that from that day on, the snail will carry the water bottle on her back as a symbol of her great journey. Snails will leave a trail of moisture behind at every place travelled, as a message to everyone that our pure water is precious and must be taken care of. So that's a rather lovely creation myth as well, which I must admit I would not have known about at all if I hadn't been researching snails, their symbolism, and how they relate to stories in literature and in oral history too. Just adjusting my snail shell here to make sure that it's fully protecting my head from the thunder and lightning, which is actually going on outside tonight. I don't know wherever you are. Tracy, I know you're in the States, and Colleen, I can't remember where you are. I think, are you in the States as well? Over here, we're actually having a rather fantastic thunderstorm, and there's been amazing forked lightning going on. So really, I should be talking about storms in literature instead of snails. Or the snails are probably out because they do love water. Apparently, they only really come out when it's wet and watery in the garden. You can tell that I'm not really a gardener because I don't know most of these facts, but I do encounter slugs quite often when I'm putting our chickens to bed at night. Not so much snails, more slugs. Anyway, the reason that I actually thought about doing this subject tonight is because I am a big fan of Louis de Bernier's Captain Corelli's Mandolin. And in this book is an absolutely iconic snail scene. And when I started thinking about this book, that was the scene that came to mind. And I then thought about how many other snail scenes are there in literature and where can we find them. But so for people that don't know Captain Corelli's Mandolin, I urge you to go out and get it immediately and read it. It's a fantastic, gripping and quite painful at times read, set on Kefalonia, where Captain Corelli has come with the Italian army in order to take over Kefalonia and to work with the Nazis. So it's actually quite a deep and painful story, but it's one where there's embedded a really fantastic love story. And I'm going to read you the beginning of the love story as told through a snail scene, which you might not necessarily expect. So this chapter is actually called Snails, and I'm going to read you a few select chunks. The doctor glanced out of the window and saw Captain Corelli creeping up on Lemony in order to give her a surprise. At the same time, Sipsina leapt foursquare onto the page he was writing about the French occupation, and this combination of circumstances inspired him with a wonderful idea. Sipsina is a kind of pine marten-like creature. He set down his pipe and his pen and ventured out into the incandescent sunlight of the early afternoon. By the way, the doctor who we're reading about here is the father of Pelagia, who is the heroine of the book. And Dr. Yanis is a really fantastic character who is one of my favourite characters in the book, which is falling apart as I read it, but I think we're going to be okay to read it. "Fischio!" exclaimed the captain, and Lemony squealed. "Excuse me, children," said the doctor. "Ah," said Corelli, straightening up sheepishly. "Kalispera, Yatre. I was just playing." He turned to the small girl. "Koretsumu, do you remember when you found Sipsina when she was very little and was hanging on the fence, and you made me come along to rescue her?" Lemony nodded importantly, and the doctor asked, "Are all the snails still there?" "Yes," she said. "Big ones. Lots." She pointed at Corelli. "Bigger than him, even." "When is the best time to find them?" "Early and late." "I see. Can you come round this evening and show me again where they were?" "After dark's best." "We can't go out after dark. There's a curfew." "Before dark," she agreed. What was all that about?" asked the captain when Lemony had departed. Stiffly, the doctor said, "Thanks to you, there's almost no food. We're going out this evening to find snails." The captain bridled. "The blockade is British. They have the idea that they can best help you by starving you. As you know very well, I've done my best to help." "Your borrowings at the expense of the army are very much appreciated, but it's a pity that the situation even arises. We need the protein. You can see what we've been reduced to." "At home, snails are an expensive luxury. And here they are a regrettable necessity." The captain wiped the perspiration from his forehead and said, "Permit me to come and help." So it was that in the evening, an hour before the setting of the sun and shortly before the cooling of the day, Pelagia and her father, Lemony and the captain, found themselves crawling through the impossible tangle of animal runs and briars, having climbed the crumbling wall and negotiated their way beneath the branches of ancient and neglected olives. The doctor was crawling behind Lemony, and suddenly she stopped and looked around at him. "You said," she reproached him, "you said that if you went around looking for snails, you'd be taken somewhere and locked up." "Piraeus," said the doctor. "I said I'd be taken to Piraeus. Anyway, we're all locked up nowadays." It became apparent in that dingy light that upon the undersides of the lower leaves there were legions of fat snails competing with each other. Oh my God. For variegation of design. There were tawny snails and almost invisible markings. There were light snails with whorls of stripes. There were snails of ochre yellow and bright lemon, and snails of red speckles and black dots. In the upper branches, the Sicilian warblers cocked their heads and flitted about, listening to the dull clacks and pings as the harvest was gathered and dropped into the buckets. The child and the three adults became so absorbed in their task that they did not notice themselves becoming separated. The doctor and Lamoni vanished down one tunnel, and the captain and Pelagia down another. At some point, the captain found himself on his own and paused for a second to reflect upon the curious fact that he could not remember ever having felt so contented. He carelessly deplored the state of the knees of his breeches and squinted up at the reddening sun as its crimson light softened among the twigs and leaves. He breathed deeply and sighed, relaxing back upon his heels. He poked with a forefinger at a snail that was attempting to crawl out of the bucket. "Bad snail," he said, and was relieved that there was no one near to hear him utter such inanities. In the distance, an anti-aircraft gun cracked, and he shrugged his shoulders. It probably was nothing. "Ow! Oh, no!" came a voice nearby that was undoubtedly Pelagia's. "Oh, for God's sake!" Horrified by the terrible thought that perhaps she'd been struck by falling shrapnel, the captain fell to his hands and knees and crawled quickly back along his tunnel towards the place from which the explanations had come. He found Pelagia, apparently paralysed into a contorted posture that had left her neck ricked backwards. She was on her hands and knees. A long, thin streak of blood was beading diagonally across her cheek, and she was clearly in a state of extreme irritation. "Che succedi?" he asked, crawling towards her. "Che succedi?" "I got my hair caught," she replied indignantly. "A thorn scraped my neck and I jerked my head away and I caught my hair on these briars and I can't untangle it. And don't laugh." "I'm not laughing," he said, laughing. "I was afraid you'd been wounded." "I am wounded. My cheek stings." Corelli reached into his pocket for a handkerchief and dabbed at the graze. He showed her the blood and said lightly, "I'll treasure this forever." "If you don't untangle me, I'll murder you. Just stop laughing." "If I don't untangle you, you'll never catch me to murder me, will you? Just hold still." He was obliged to reach his hands over her shoulders and peer past her ear in order to see what he was doing. She found her face pressing into his chest, and she took in the rough texture and dusty aroma of his uniform. "You're squashing my nose," she protested. Corelli sniffed appreciatively. Pelagia always smelled of rosemary. It was a young, fresh scent, and it reminded him of festive meals at home. "I might have to cut this," he said, pulling futilely at the black strands that had wound themselves about the thorns. "Ow! Ow! Stop pulling it about. Just be careful, and you're not cutting it." "You're in a very vulnerable position," he remarked, "so just try to appear grateful." He tugged it out, piece by piece, ensuring that he let no hairs slide between his fingers to cause her any pain. His arms began to ache from being held so much in a stretched and horizontal position, and he rested his elbows on her shoulders. "I've done it," he said, pleased with himself, and began to draw back. She shook her head with relief, and as the captain's lips passed by her cheek, he kissed it gently before the ear, where there was an almost invisible, soft down. She touched her fingertips to the site of the kiss and reproached him. "You shouldn't have done that." He knelt back and held her gaze with his own. "I couldn't help it." "It was taking advantage." "I'm sorry." They looked at one another for a long moment, and then, for reasons that even she could not fathom, Pelagia began to cry. I'm just going to skip to the end of that chapter and then give you the last little bit of snail action. "Everything is lousy," agreed the captain, wondering if he too might yield to the temptation to cry. He took her head gently in his hands and touched at the tears with his lips. She gazed at him wonderingly, and suddenly they found themselves, underneath the briars in the sunset, flanked by 2 buckets of escaping snails, their knees sore and filthy, infinitely enclosed in their first unpatriotic and secret kiss. Hungry and desperate, filled with light, they could not draw away from each other. and when finally they returned home at dusk, their combined booty shamefully and accusingly failed to reach the quota reached by Lemony, on her own. So that is the first section of the extremely romantic story of Captain Corelli and Pelagia, who are on different sides of this war and whose love is therefore surely doomed. But throughout this fantastic and romantic book, we very much root for their love. And there's a lot of extreme drama that goes on in the book with bombs exploding and terrible war crimes being enacted, which I won't go into because that's not relevant to the snails. But I just want to read you a little extra snaily section relating to that scene, because when I was thinking about this snail scene, what I remembered most was the bit that's coming up now, not the crawling through the tunnels, although that's incredibly romantic too. So we've just had the explosion of a bomb, and it's the same day as Captain Corelli and Pelagia were looking for snails. But on the evening of that splendid event, the enraged doctor emerged from the kitchen, intending to find Pelagia and give her a piece of his mind, when not only his daughter, but an entire crowd of inconceivably filthy, exhausted, and ragged folk turned up at the yard. An unrecognisable man, as large as Carlo, who later turned out to be Carlo, was bearing in his arms the raving body of someone who later turned out to be the captain. A young woman who looked like some mad and irredeemable slut from the most iniquitously impoverished quarter of Cairo turned out to be Pelagia. A tiny thing that could have been either a boy or a girl dug from an early grave turned out to be Lemony. He would be busy all night cleaning cuts, and he would earn a spectacular profit in aubergines, which at that time were just coming into season. But at that moment, confronted by the sorry crowd of disoriented and beggarish soldiers and Greeks, all he could think of was the repellent and astounding spectacle he'd just encountered in the kitchen. "Who," he roared rhetorically, "has had the audacity to fill my house with snails?" It was true. There were snails everywhere. They were on the windows, under the rims of tables, perpendicularly sideways on the walls, and on Cypsina's bowl, in the water jug, glued inadvisedly to the mats, proceeding with a determination towards the vegetable basket, and clinging with quixotic relish to the stem of the doctor's pipe, and the glasses of the spectacles that in all innocence he had left upon the sill. Pelagia put her hand to her mouth in guilty horror, and Lemony, perceiving the silvery meandering crisscrossing, glistening trails, and the delightfully random distribution of the beasts themselves, clapped her hands in joy. "Porca puttana," she said, and a man who must have been her father clipped her sharply about the side of her head. So that's the scene which inspired me to take us on this slithery trail tonight, because I just love the exploding snails which all come out of the bucket and take over the house and create a kind of mad chaos, which are very much reflecting on the chaos which is also happening on the island with the Nazis encroaching on Kefalonia and people turning to rather desperate acts. So do read Captain Corelli, not just for the snail scene. It's a really fantastic story. And thinking of stories in which snails explode and come out of a bucket and take over a room, I would now like to move on to the rather sinister story by Patricia Highsmith, who was a lover of all animals, particularly snails. So Patricia Highsmith is well known for writing her brilliant books about which are frequently crime books, such as The Talented Mr. Ripley, but she's also famous more recently for her book The Price of Salt, also known as Carol, which was about a gay relationship between two women, which is a really excellent read. And Patricia Highsmith was known to be a great lover of snails. She kept snails by the hundred as pets and took them to parties, clinging to a leaf of lettuce in her handbag. Critic and writer Terry Castle describes how she once smuggled her pet snails through the French customs by hiding 6 or 8 of them under each bosom. That's quite a bizarre image, is it not? She was famous for her wit and wicked sense of humour, and she wrote very compellingly about loneliness and empathetically about disempowered housewives and children. Her short story, The Snail Watcher, is strangely compelling. It's about Peter Nuppert, who becomes obsessed with snails. And it being Patricia Highsmith, it is a bit of a dark story. I'm just going to give you a couple of extracts. It's very short. You can actually find it on the web and print it out. And it's only about 8 pages long. So I won't give it all away, but it is a really good read. And I'll just read you a couple of little sections to get the atmosphere of this very snaily tale. The Snail Watcher. When Mr. Peter Nuppert began to make a hobby of snail watching, he had no idea that his handful of specimens would become hundreds in no time. So remember that fact about how snails can produce snail babies up to 450 per year. That's quite a lot of snail babies. Only 2 months after the original snails were carried up to the Nuppert study, some 30 glass tanks and bowls, all teeming with snails, lined the walls, rested on the desks and windowsills, and were beginning even to cover the floor. Mrs. Nuppert disapproved strongly and would no longer enter the room. It smelled, she said, and besides, she had once stepped on a snail by accident, a horrible sensation she would never forget. But the more his wife and friends deplored his unusual and vaguely repellent pastime, the more pleasure Mr. Nuppert seemed to find in it. "I never cared for nature before in my life," Mr. Nuppert often remarked. He was a partner in a brokerage firm, a man who devoted all his life to the science of finance. But snails have opened my eyes to the beauty of the animal world. I just want to read you a couple more sections because it is actually a very funny, if dark, story. And I do love Patricia Highsmith's writing. Here we go. His wife Edna told him either to eat the snails or get rid of them. It was at this time that she stepped upon a snail that had crawled out onto the floor, and Mr. Nuppert might have, if he hadn't come across a sentence in Darwin's Origin of Species on a page given to Gastropoda. The sentence was in French, a language Mr. Nuppert did not know, but the word sensuality made him tense like a bloodhound that had suddenly found the scent. He was in the public library at the time, and laboriously he translated the sentence with the aid of a French-English dictionary. It was a statement of less than 100 words, saying that snails manifested a sensuality in their mating that was not to be found anywhere in the animal kingdom. That was all. I'm going to read you a little bit about him observing the snails, because that is one of the most interesting and slightly odd bits of writing that I've recently come across. Mr. Nuppert continued to observe the pair of snails, off and on, for more than an hour, until first the ears, then the rods withdrew, and the snails themselves relaxed their attitudes and paid no further attention to each other. But by that time, a different pair of snails had begun a flirtation, and were slowly rearing themselves to get into position for kissing. Mr. Nuppert told the cook that the snails were not to be served that evening. He took the bowl of them up to his study, and snails were never again served in the Nuppert household. Then there's more, talking about how the snails create their babies, which is really interesting. He observes them making a little kind of well in the sand that they live in, and then on top of the sand you suddenly get these tiny little baby snails appearing, and it is fascinating. We do feel when reading this short story that we are in the presence of a rather brilliant nature observer, and I'm just going to read you a tiny bit of that. One snail he couldn't pick up. The shell might have been glued to the earth. Mr. Noppet suspected the snail had buried its head in the ground to die. 2 more days went by, and on the morning of the 3rd, Mr. Noppet found a spot of crumbly earth where the snail had been. Curious, he investigated the crumbles with a match stem, and to his delight, discovered a pit full of shiny new eggs. Snail eggs! He hadn't been wrong. Mr. Noppet called his wife and the cook to look at them. The eggs looked very much like big caviar, only they were white instead of black or red. By the way, one of the fascinating snail facts I discovered today is that in many cultures, snail eggs are eaten as a kind of caviar. Well, naturally they have to breed some way, was his wife's comment. Mr. Noppet couldn't understand her lack of interest. He had to go and look at the eggs every hour that he was at home. He looked at them every morning to see if any change had taken place, and the eggs were his last thought every night before he went to bed. Moreover, another snail was now digging a pit, and another pair of snails was mating. The first batch of eggs turned a greyish colour, and minuscule spirals of shells became discernible on one side of each egg. Mr. Noppet's anticipation rose to a higher pitch. At last, a morning arrived, the 18th after laying, according to Mr. Noppet's careful count, when he looked down into the egg pit and saw the first tiny moving head, the first stubby little antennae, uncertainly exploring the nest. Mr. Noppet was as happy as the father of a new child. Every one of the 70 or more eggs in the pit came, miraculously, to life. He'd seen the entire reproductive cycle evolve to a successive conclusion. And the fact that no one, at least no one that he knew of, was acquainted with a fraction of what he knew, lent his knowledge a thrill of discovery, the piquancy of the esoteric. So Mr. Noppet spends a lot of time observing his snails. He gets more and more obsessed, and the more obsessed he gets, the more brilliantly he does in his job, which is finance, and he makes lots of amazing, daring decisions with his finance and becomes more and more excellent in his work. Then he gets distracted by his work, and the snails start doing their own thing in his study. And I won't tell you what happens, but it's a really great short story. I just want to talk to you a tiny bit about medieval snails, because in medieval manuscripts, it's a common theme that you find marginalia where there are knights fighting against snails. Here is an example. I hope you can see that. The snail is just there, and there's the knight. The snail is really not very large compared to the knight. It's probably the size of the knight's head, but the knight does seem to be engaged in a very serious battle against the snail. And there's a lot of similar pictures. Sorry, they're not very big. These are reproductions that I've done, trying to show you there on Instagram and on Facebook. So the snail in this one is again, where is it? Really tiny. And there's our knight, who's a lot bigger than the snail. But he's very earnestly battling against that snail. Similarly, I've got a couple more. I rather love this one, where the snail is actually quite a good size. It's definitely as big or bigger than the knight and looks fantastically sinister. And this one I find very comic, where this rather apologetic looking knight is tackling a snail which is only really the size of his shoulders, probably, but he's looking very earnest and trying to conquer the snail. And why is this, people ask? What is it that makes these knights constantly fight their snails? Look at that tiny little snail, there it is. And there's the knight, there we go, having a little bit of a fight against that snail. It's very peculiar, and many speculations have been made. Some have said that the snail possibly represented the resurrection in some of the pictures. Some said that the snail was a symbol of the Lombards, who were a group vilified in the early Middle Ages for treasonous behaviour. the sin of usury, and non-chivalrous comportment in general. Snails were at the time often used to symbolise laziness, so it could be that the knights are in some way tackling and fighting against laziness. And other scholars have described the knight versus snail motif as a representation of the struggles of the poor against an oppressive aristocracy, which is a straightforward statement of the snail's troublesome reputation as a garden pest, a commentary on social climbers, or even as a saucy symbol of female sexuality. So it's possible that these symbols might have represented any of these things at different times throughout the medieval canon, but it's just rather intriguing that there are so many rather wonderful knights tackling valiant snails. So medieval snails, there's a lot of wonderful ones in medieval manuscripts, and there, once you start looking for them, you'll find a lot of really fantastic medieval snail images. And I just love the slight sense of comedy that you have when you see these rather tiny squidgy snails being conquered by very brave knights. Considering the Snail by Tom Gunn is a rather wonderful poem about a snail, which I'm just going to share with you before moving on to a couple of last books about snails. So, Considering the Snail by Tom Gunn, 2009. The snail pushes through a green night, for the grass is heavy with water, and meets over the bright path he makes, where rain has darkened the earth's dark. He moves in a wood of desire, pale antlers barely stirring as he hunts. I cannot tell what power is at work, drenched there with purpose, knowing nothing. What is a snail's fury? All I think is that if later I parted the blades above the tunnel and saw the thin trail of broken white across litter, I would never have imagined the slow passion to that deliberate progress. So that's a poem which is also interpreted in many different ways, a bit like the knight tackling the snail in the medieval manuscript. It can be said to represent mankind moving through the different stages of life, from childhood to adulthood to potentially accepting mortality. But it is one of those poems that you can read again and again and ponder deeply. So that's Considering the Snail by Tom Gunn. Another book I just want to talk about now is The Sound of a Snail, which is a really fantastic memoir by Elizabeth Tova Bailey, which is all about her illness and how she was saved from her extreme illness by a snail. So I'll read you a little bit about this book, which unfortunately I don't have in concrete form, but it is a book that I feel that all of you would love to read, because it's a very thoughtful, profound and lovely memoir of illness and being saved by a symbol of nature. Essayist and short story writer Elizabeth Tova Bailey was struck with a neurological disorder that left her too weak to even sit up. The illness forced her to stay in bed, where she felt life was slipping by unused. But things changed for Bailey when a friend bought her a gift, a pot of flowers that also contained a wild snail, which the friend had plucked from the ground. This nearly motionless mollusk became Bailey's companion. So I've got a picture of where I believe she kept her snail, which was in a kind of terrarium in her bedroom next to her bed. And it's a very moving story, which very much goes through Bailey's illness and talks about her slow recovery, which in a way parallels the slow movement of the snail. I'll just read you a tiny bit more. Elizabeth Bailey was 34 when she was struck with a mysterious flu-like illness while travelling to Switzerland. When she returned home, the flu symptoms subsided, but her health did not return. She felt weak and dizzy and was almost unable to sit up. And she ended up being ill and unable to move for a very long time. When her friend brought her the snail, she actually began to turn a bit of a corner. And I'm just trying to find the place which describes that moment because it's a rather lovely moment in the book. Here we go. In early spring, a friend went for a walk in the woods and, glancing down at the path, saw a snail. Picking it up, she held it gingerly in the palm of her hand and carried it back up towards the studio where I was convalescing. She noticed some field violets on the edge of the lawn. Finding a trowel, she dug a few up, then planted them in a terracotta pot and placed the snail beneath their leaves. She brought the pot into my studio and put it by my bedside. So that's, I think, that's this pot. I found a snail in the woods. I brought it back and it's right here beneath the violets. You did? Why did you bring it in? I don't know. I thought you might enjoy it. Is it alive? She picked up the brown acorn-sized shell and looked at it. I think it is. Why, I wondered, would I enjoy a snail? What on earth would I do with it? I couldn't get out of bed to return it to the woods. It was not of much interest, and if it was alive, the responsibility, especially for a snail, something so uncalled for, was overwhelming. My friend hugged me, said goodbye, and drove off. At age 34, on a brief trip to Europe, I was felled by a mysterious viral or bacterial pathogen, resulting in severe neurological symptoms. I'd thought I was indestructible, but I wasn't. If anything did go wrong, I figured modern medicine would fix me, but it didn't. Medical specialists at several major clinics couldn't diagnose the infectious culprit. I was in and out of hospital for months, and the complications were life-threatening. An experimental drug that became available stabilized my condition, though it would be several grueling years to a partial recovery and a return to work. My doctor said the illness was behind me, and I wanted to believe them. I was ecstatic to have most of my life back. But out of the blue came a series of insidious relapses, and once again I was bedridden. Further, more sophisticated testing showed that the mitochondria in my cells no longer functioned correctly, and there was damage to my autonomic nervous system. All functions not consciously directed, including heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion, had gone haywire. The drug that had previously helped now caused dangerous side effects. It would soon be removed from the market. When the body is rendered useless, the mind still runs like a bloodhound along well-worn trails of neurons, tracking the echoing questions, the confused family of whys, whats, and whens, and their impossibly distant kin in how. The search is exhaustive, the answers elusive. Sometimes my mind went blank and listless. At other times it was flooded with storms of thought, unspeakable sadness, and intolerable loss. Given the ease with which health infuses life with meaning and purpose, it is shocking how swiftly illness steals away these certainties. It was all I could do to get through each moment, and each moment felt like an endless hour, yet days slipped silently past. Time unused and only endured still vanishes, as if time itself is starving, and each day is swallowed whole, leaving no crumbs, no memory, no trace at all. I won't read all of it because there's a lot of wonderful, beautiful sentences in this memoir, which I would really recommend that everyone should read, believe it or not. A memoir about a snail, you would imagine might not be the most gripping read, but believe me, it is a gripping read. The full title, I think, is Suddenly unable to remember it exactly. Elizabeth Tova Bailey is the author, and it's The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. I think that's the title. I'll put it on the post after the session tonight. And Elizabeth is essentially saved by the snail. She does say at one point in the book that she thinks she probably would not have survived this period of illness if it hadn't been for that snail that her friend brought her unexpectedly out of the blue. And it wasn't even an interesting snail. It was just a common garden, boring brown snail. But this snail somehow, for various reasons, completely transforms her life. She says, "What about this snail? What would I do with it? As tiny as it had been going about its day when it was picked up. What right did my friend and I have to disrupt its life?" Though I couldn't imagine what kind of life a snail might lead. I didn't remember ever having noticed any snails on my countless hikes in the woods. Perhaps, I thought, looking at this nondescript brown creature, it was precisely because they were so inconspicuous. For the rest of the day, the snail stayed inside its shell, and I was too worn out from my friend's visit to give it another thought. However, she does go on to write an entire memoir about the snail, and during that book you discover lots of fantastic snail facts, such as the fact that snails cannot hear and they can barely see. They have an acute sense of smell. They have eyes on the top of their 2 tentacles that sprout from their head, and they only have 1 foot. They have 2,640 teeth, 80 rows, which the author likens to a rasp. So that's just some of the fascinating snail facts that you can find in that book. But I think what's really beautiful and memorable about the memoir is that the writer, Elizabeth, through her illness, began to appreciate time in a different way through watching the snail. And she began to rediscover a reason to live, quite simply, through watching the mollusk. So that is a book that you should definitely all read. And before I end this lovely snail session, I really want to share with you The Snail and the Whale by Julia Donaldson, one of my favourite children's books that we used to read to our children. And this tells the story of a very brave, plucky and adventurous snail. And I'll just read you a tiny bit of it so that you know how brilliant it is. But I would definitely recommend it to readers of all ages. This is a tale of a tiny snail and a great big grey-blue humpback whale. This is a rock as black as soot, and this is a snail with an itchy foot. There he is. The sea snail slithered all over the rock and gazed at the sea and the ships in the dock. And as she gazed, she sniffed and sighed. "The sea is deep and the world is wide. How I long to sail," said the tiny snail. These are the other snails in the flock, who all stuck tight to the smooth black rock, and said to the snail with the itchy foot, "Be quiet, don't wriggle, sit still, stay put." But the tiny sea snail sighed and sniffed, then cried, "I've got it, I'll hitch a lift." This is the trail of the tiny snail, a silvery trail that looped and curled and said, "Lift wanted around the world." This is the whale who came one night when the tide was high and the stars were bright. A humpback whale immensely long, who sang to the snail a wonderful song of shimmering ice and coral caves and shooting stars and enormous waves. And this is the tale of the humpback whale. He held it out of the starlit sea and said to the snail, "Come sail with me." And off went the snail, talking to the adventurer within us all. And without giving too much away of this ripping yarn, the whale gets beached and gets stuck on a sandy beach. back in England, tragically, and the snail has to do something amazing in order to save the whale. The snail makes her way into a classroom and writes with her trail, "Save the whale," and all the children are able to go down to the beach with their teachers and save the whale. So, frankly, that's one of the best snail stories I've ever read. But I wonder if you've got any fantastic snail stories that you would like to share with me. Do you have any interesting snail scenes in books? I'm sure there's a lot of French novels that have snails in them. I think Perfume by Patrick Suskind has a big snail scene, but I haven't had time to research that. I know that it's a rich topic which I could go into far more deeply. However, this week I'm actually doing a lot of painting because I'm going to the North Cornwall Book Festival in 2 weeks' time. And for that, I'm painting portraits of authors, which are going to be exhibited at that festival. And one of the authors that I've been painting is Louis de Bernier himself. And I was able to go to his house and sketch and draw and photograph him, which was very exciting, and talk about Captain Corelli and snails, of course. And I've also got a lot of other authors that I'm painting. So that's taking up a lot of my time. So next week I am doing a session all about artists in literature, and that will be on the Damien Barr Literary Salon Facebook page and Instagram live. So do please come along to that. It's going to be all about artists in literature, and I will look forward to seeing you there. Thanks so much for joining me this evening, and I have loved sharing thoughts about snails with you. See you soon. Good night.